Make the same grip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the
Caribbean. And welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, our open word edition on a Wednesday evening. For some of you, it's a Wednesday night. For some of you, it's a Wednesday afternoon. But it's the Wednesday edition. Welcome to our program. Welcome to Politics 101. What a week it has been. On Monday, of course, we spent time remembering and celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and trying to link his struggles with our struggle in Guyana. And then, of course, on that very day, Monday, it was Budget Day in Guyana. And last night, we had young Elson Lowe on, giving us some preliminary perspectives on the 1.14 trillion budget. As I remarked last night, after our program, I spent the hour with Mr. Duncan Sherrod on his program. And as I remark on that program and my own program, that never in the wildest dream would I have thought that I would have lived to hear $1 trillion budget in Guyana. And I kept making the point, as we've been making here, a lot has changed in Guyana. A lot has changed. Whether it's changed for the better or the worse is another story. But when you have $1 trillion budget in a country like Guyana, that's big. That's nothing to trifle about. So those of you who sometimes, I know for emotional reasons, may say, well, nothing has changed. A lot has changed. It's whether it's changed for the better or the worse. $1.1 trillion budget. And when you remember that last year, the government went 5 times. They went back to Parliament for supplementals. One could imagine that by the time the end of the year, they'll be spending $1.5 trillion. Welcome to our Wednesday evening edition. And today, of course, it's the open word edition. We're going to have Professor Clive Thomas on. And Kadaki Amsterdam is going to be here to co-host the program with me. I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining us from Guyana, whether you're joining us from Linden or in the interior, whether you're joining us from Berbice. And I spent most of my night last night watching cricket, the first day of the first test, West Indies versus Australia. And of course, you couldn't help. Berbice, they were talking about Berbice, Baracara, young Shamar Joseph made his debut last night, yesterday in Australia. He came in at number 11, made 36 runs, which was the second highest score. West Indies, of course, was bundled out for 188, not unexpectedly. And in reply, Australia's are 59 for 2. Both wickets falling to Joseph, who took a wicket with his first ball in Test cricket. And what a wicket to get, Stephen Smith, with almost 10,000 Test runs. Certainly one of the best batsmen of his generation. And Joseph got him with the first ball in Test cricket. Only 23 people have done so in the history of the game. And the commentators, the Australian commentators, Brian Lara was in the commentary booth. They kept talking about Berbice. It was a good night. It's a good time to be Guyanese. I mean, you hear your country being mentioned so often. And that story of that young man is quite the story of most working class young men and women coming from Baracara, which is way up the Kanji Creek, Kanji River, coming from a maroon community. They say it's the only maroon community in Guyana. Research has shown that there have been more maroon communities, but Baracara is known as one of the best known maroon community. So the young man is a maroon. I ain't staying on this plantation. I going, I gone. And they went up and set up that settlement there. It's still there, Baracara, up the Kanji River. And he tells the story that he started to play his game by bowling with fruits. It's a community of about 300 and 350 people, Baracara. And you heard them talk about Baracara, Berbice, Kanji, Guyana. It was nice, And that's how we make our mark on the world. When our people go on the world stage and perform. And so when we think about our politics, and when we think about a budget of almost $1.2 trillion, and nothing in that budget for the Baracaras of Guyana, nothing in the budget for communities like those, not much in the budget for the alleviation of poverty, not much in the budget for cost of living allowance. When you think of a young man on the world stage, batting and bowling for Guyana, telling the world that young men and women from a little place like Guyana have something to say. Here is the government of Guyana criminally neglecting the poor and the powerless. The poor and the powerless. Shamar Joseph is there lifting Guyana up, lifting the Caribbean up. And the government in Guyana is burying the Shamar Josephs in Guyana. Young man had to leave Baracara, come to the coast, had to leave Berbice, come to Georgetown, took a job as a security guard. That's the story, that's the story of all of us. And now we have the means by which to transform the Shamar Josephs of this country. And our government is neglecting to do so. $200 million for bridges and roads and so on. $129 million for health, $135 million for education, $97 million for agriculture. Not very much there. 7 billion. 7 billion. $7 billion, let me go that over. I said million just now, I meant billions. 200 billion for roads and public works. 125 billion, 29 billion for health. 135 for education. 97 for agriculture. And the mere $7 billion for wages. And we're going to be talking about that today. The government also said it expects that inflation in 2024 is going to be at 2%, and that for 2023 it was 4%. A lot of the opposition people are disputing that. And I've learned from Professor Clive Thomas that we have obligations to provide those data to the World Bank and to the United Nations. And so there are implications for the data that the government is presenting. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about inflation and cost of living today. And the reason we're going to do so, we're going to leave the budget until Professor goes through the budget and studies it and in his meticulous way. And then probably next week we'll get to that. But for this week, we want to talk about inflation and cost of living. They're related, but they're different constructs. And if you get yourself tangled up, you could make the wrong analysis. And so, for the purposes of public education, part of which we do on Politics 101, we're going to ask Professor Thomas for us, laymen and women, to deal with this question of inflation, cost of living, and high prices, and what you do about high prices. Because when I peruse the budget, I haven't been able to go through the physical budget, but when I listen to parts of the budget presentation in the National Assembly and read summaries of the budget in the media, I was looking for cost of living relief. I was looking for what is being done about poverty. Unfortunately, I was disappointed. Welcome to Politics 101. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome. Those of you who are joining us from Berbice, from down the Kanji River, a special welcome to you. Those of you who are joining us from the west side, from Essequibo Coast, good evening. Good evening and welcome to our program, our midweek program. Those of you who are joining us from the Caribbean, the near diaspora, because I don't consider those of us who are in the Caribbean as the diaspora, because we are the Caribbean, we are part of the Caribbean. Welcome to those of you from the United States of America, Canada, Europe, in particular the United Kingdom, and France. Welcome to Politics 101. It's a good time to be a Guyanese. It's a good time to be a Guyanese. $1.1 trillion budget. We got money. There are those who sometimes, when you listen to them, you think that we haven't gotten money. Yes, the contract is not the best contract. In fact, it's more worse than good. And that fight is a legitimate fight. But we think that the fight for a proper distribution, a proper allocation, a proper prioritization of what you get is an equally important fight. And so we got money that we never had before. We could have gotten more with a better contract, but that's another story for another day. But we get more today than we ever had before. So I want us to start off tonight with those two things in mind. We got more money than we ever had before, and that must count for something. In terms of any measurement, GDP, GNP, and all the economic measurement, growth rate, we are way up there. I mean, in terms of per capita, GDP and per capita income, we're up there in the top 10. They're pecking it at $30,000 US. We're up there in the top 10 in terms of the amount of oil that we are said to have. And when you talk to Professor Thomas, he will tell you that the projection is nearly not half of what we really have. Professor Thomas was talking about 27 25 to 27 million barrels. And they're now talking upwards of that to about 30 million. So things are happening. We're no longer poor Guyana in the sense that we haven't got the resources to do things for ourselves. Welcome to Politics 101 on a Wednesday evening. Just share the link and let them know that we're on. Professor Thomas is here this evening. And as I said, we're going to be doing some Economics 101 tonight. And joining me as co-host is the host of Bostonian Guyanese Morning Time, Kidaki Amsterdam. Let me bring in Professor and Kidaki. And Kidaki, good evening to you.
Good evening, viewers. Good evening, Dr. Hines. Thank you for having me on.
And Professor
evening,
Thomas,
Professor.
I'm getting an echo. All right.
And that echo is from me?
Yes, I think it's coming from your end. Yeah. Professor Thomas, welcome to this evening's edition of Open Word, Politics 101.
Good evening, David, and good evening, Kidaki.
Professor Thomas, let's get straight into the meat of the matter.
I
Over
think
the
you
last
exhibited,
week,
I
go
think
ahead.
you exhibited a lot of that by the initial reference.
Yes.
The size of the budget, 1.147 something plus going on, $1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
And you compared it to the numbers you're accustomed to. Could you imagine what it is for me, who've been around a little longer?
Yes.
To me, $1 billion used to be a lot of money. And I grew up teaching people sums of money that operated in the region of the millions. And then it came to be the billions. And now we're talking about the trillions, all within one lifetime. And the trillions, of course, 112 knots after it. A billion was 109, and a million is 106.
6.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It has been a momentous journey. But I think it symbolizes an important point you've been trying to emphasize in the introduction to the program. That we've grown to such a size, even though we're using an exchange rate where it is now like 205, 206, 210, when you buy or sell to $1 compared to before, but still is so large that it considerably outstretches or outreaches beyond what we were able to mobilize before and to spend as part of the government's budget. So that alone signifies how far up the scale of expenditure we've gone, even in real terms, when you take into account the fact that the exchange rate has depreciated. When I was a boy, it was $1 to 484 Guyanese dollars and 80 cents. Now it wants at $200 or on 5 cents, maybe up to 12, 15 cents, within that range for $1. But despite that, the size increased, the nominal size increased, based on the numbers that we're talking about, is so great that we can't mistake the importance of the difference.
Professor Clive Thomas there? Yes. Sorry, Professor, I thought you were finished.
No, I'm finished. Yeah, I'm finished making that introductory point.
That introductory point. Kidaki, you have your first question for Professor?
Yes. Good afternoon. Good evening again. We're talking about the budget and the cost of living. The first thing I recognize is the size of our budgets have changed. We're talking about $1 trillion budget. Now, But has the attitude changed, Professor, in your view, to what I say, planning of the economy?
Well, I of course have to confess that I've not read this current budget yet. The reason why I was speaking to you all at the introduction of the program in our backroom discussion was because we are waiting receipt of the budget, but the budget did come just before the program. So I haven't been able to read it yet, this year's budget. I've seen what's in the papers, but that is merely a summary. But the budget is a big, heavy document which requires detailed study. So I won't have been in a position to comment in detail on anything that is significant in the current budget. But the size stands out, and I think we can take note, we should take note of that, because it signifies the importance of oil, which we never had before as a significant element in our budget before the 2020, when we started really to produce oil. Our first oil was in December 2019, I think around the 19th of December 2019, and the first full year of production was 2020. And since then, we've gone up to close to 500,000 barrels a day, which is on the way to what I expect might be within the region of $2 million to $2.5 million by 2030s. That's another couple of years from now. So from that point of view, the future looks very good in terms of the inflow of oil money. The question, as far as I'm concerned, is the priority question is how are we going to spend that money? How are we going to make the best use of the resources that we have? That, I think, is a challenge. There's also the challenge of trying to get more money out of the oil companies running it. But that, I think, pales in significance over the fact that we do have such substantial funds that we are now enter an era in which we have to fight to distribute money and distribute income to allocate resources that we have in such abundance that before we used to be concerned with the privations of poverty, and now we have to deal with the privations of plenty. We have to shift our mindset because we have to get this country to become a real world-class country, and I think we can by the 2030s.
Just to follow up on Kadaki's question, Professor, there's been one government since we started to draw down from oil. As you said, the first full year was 2020. This government came into office in 2020. And given what you have seen thus far, is there a suggestion? Is there a sense that the thinking of those who are managing this transformation into a petrol state, is there a sense that their thinking as regards economic planning and economic priorities have changed?
Well, I would say that they have not changed, but they have not changed for the better. They might in some ways have gotten worse, because there's been a traditional attitude in Guyana and in other poor countries to treat development as a gift to the people, not an entitlement or a right that they have. So the distribution of resources is seen as primarily focused on trying to make the government look good. If you notice from everything that I've read in the papers, the attitude of the government seems to be one in which whenever a concession is made or some social protection measures introduced, they say, we give you this. It is not like it was evolving as the entitlement and the rights of the Guyanese citizens, but it is something that the government is giving. When they, like us, are all of us benefiting from what is a windfall, that is the miraculous discovery of oil in such abundance and scale and quality and everything that we desire from oil at this point in time that has transformed Guyana to become the fastest growing country in the world.
Professor Clive Thomas, in case you're just joining us, yes, it's our Wednesday edition of Politics 101, the open word with Professor Clive Thomas. My co-host tonight is my brother and comrade, Kadaki Amsterdam of the Guyanese Morning Time. You can catch him every morning, well, Monday through Friday, at 7 o'clock Guyana time. And of course, you catch me at 7 o'clock Guyana time in the evening. He's in the morning. And he's here co-hosting tonight's program with me. Professor, there are certain terms that have become very commonplace in popular discourse in Guyana. And one of those terms has been inflation. I remember when you unveiled on your own behalf and on behalf of the WPA the Buxton proposal, that is the proposal for structured legal cash transfers in Buxton in 2018. One of the first criticism of the proposal was that it will lead to inflation. And since then, that word is being thrown around left, right, and center. What I want you to do for us this evening, not for the first time, because I've asked you this question before, is so we have inflation, then we have cost of living, and then we have high prices. These are concepts. I think they're related as a layperson. I think they're related, but they are different concepts. What I want you to do is to define them in terms for us, for our viewers, so we can leave this program with a keen sense of what is what, as we would say in Guyanese parlance. Over to you, however you choose to go about answering that question.
Well, first of all, what I want to do is to convince people that these are not arbitrary terms. These terms have been developed by economists over the years. And as countries have evolved, particularly coming into the 21st century, countries have undertaken global decisions at the United Nations particularly, and that the two, what we call Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, that every member of these countries will subscribe to these two institutions as being the deciding institutions for the measurement, the methodology, and the governance of the development of these indices worldwide. So when we talk about inflation, and they publish the Guyana Central Bank report or the Bureau Statistics report, these measures are agreed on and the methodology agreed on universally. Governments, as part of the contract of being a nation in the United Nations, as part of being able to say they're a member of the IMF, as a member of the World Bank, give them the authority to regulate the concepts, the methodologies, and the instruments that should be used in the provision of these data. Indeed, your status in these institutions, your continued status indeed, actually depend on your delivery of these measures. That's part of the treaty obligation. So these things that we throw wrong and believe that are whimsical things that are created by Guyana purely and simply as a humbug or something the government can manipulate is not entirely true. There might have been instances like that when you were doing the initial statistics, like when we created the first national council in the West Indies. That was done by the University of the West Indies at Mona. That's the first job I had, to participate in that work with Carlene O'Loughlin, the famous Australian economist who did the first national council of the West Indian nation. At that time, that's how we started. But now these are legal obligations that the states have to fulfill. And the methods and everything are agreed on by treaty. So if no country, I think, would willingly put themselves at risk by producing counterfeit figures, although I won't put it past some countries to attempt to do that, because we had an era when we had a lot of disputes with the Soviet Union and China and the progressive communist socialist societies that before the different methodology, but it came to final agreement on the methodology used to identify these elements in the contract, in the concepts, and we agreed on a system of regulation. So the data now becomes incontestable data. So no country has an ability to challenge the data in their country, separate from challenging all the data in all the countries. Because even if they have elements of doubt in them, they are randomly distributed over all the countries in the world. And their effect cannot alter any one set of countries differently from others. And if it did so, it would not be just because of the country, it might be because of the type of country. The developed countries might be more market oriented, so you can get more of the prices that they think are important than developed countries. We don't have developed markets, so we can't go there and take the price. Those are the things that I think we have to understand.
Right.
So these things are not pushed on us. We have voluntarily, because we feel it's important to be a member of the UN. It's important to be a member of the World Bank. It's important to be a member of the IMF. Have agreed that they would determine the methodology, and they have established institutions in the region. We have a regional center, dedicated towards establishing and standardizing these information across the region. And the reason why they do that is to ensure that regional disparities or peculiarities of culture and society and practice can be incorporated so that they do not fall far out of step with what is happening with the rest of the world. You can make adjustments and take that into account.
Mm-hmm.
That is why some really progressive sounding policies usually end up in a dead end. Like the feminist movement, for example, fought very hard for the inclusion of housework of housewives or domestic help within the household to be part of the national accounts. The case can be made for it easily at a theoretical level, but at a practical level, if it's not incorporated, it means not that it's that this data that you have is not significant, but that you say the data that you have is data collected in every country without taking into account household work. And that is sufficiently representative of what is happening in the economy, as if the data had included household work. Because the differences would just be in the size of the data from every country, but not necessarily in the way in which they behave in relation to other variables, so that you can plan the development of your economy.
Uh-huh.
So I think that needs to be understood, but a lot of people, not only in Guyana, all around the world, find it difficult to, because a lot of this is based on their personal experience. And they tend to feel that they go to the shop, they see prices rise, and they want to know why that is not inflation. But inflation is more strictly defined according to those statistics. Inflation talks about the rate at which the prices are increasing. The rate at which the prices are increasing. So if the rate at which the prices are increasing is decreasing, then you can't have inflation. And so what inflation measures the rate at which prices are increasing. We might do it annually or quarterly, or some countries even do it monthly, like the US, they do it weekly. But they have highly developed markets, so you can do samples of what is happening in various areas and do the calculation quickly. But in Guyana, our statistics tend to be more backward looking. So they come out a little late, and we therefore have to do it at an annual level because we just don't have the capabilities to do it at a faster, more regular interval. But actually can be done even daily because the computing power of the world would make that possible. But some really developed economies do it. That is why the United States have so many business programs on television and worldwide, because they live on these data daily or sometimes hourly, minute by minute by minute. Because once you do establish the samples and you have established the source of the data, as it happens, you can publish it now because of the digitization of so much of that information and the volumes that can be handled, that they can tell you what the price of oil is now shipped and delivered, let's say, at a port in Greece at this moment in time. I can go on the internet and get it exactly as it is. And that's available to every country.
Right, right. So
we publish the statistics and the various oil prices that are around the world. But we tend to use what is called the Brent crude oil price, because that's the price more representative of the market that we sell in. But there's another price right up the road here where we can use too, the Western trading index from the United States. But we use that one because we tend to sell most of our oil across the Atlantic, across the seas going into Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, and places like that.
Cost of living, Professor?
Yeah, the cost of living uses the same data.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really spoken about the data, but let's go start with the inflation data. That is what first you have to do a household budget survey and try to find out what consumers spend their incomes on. And based on that, you select the goods that they spend their income on. Let's say they spend 5% on healthcare, 30% on housing, 30% on healthcare, 2% in education, 1% of financial services or whatever it is, banking and so on. You have to go and do the survey, which we've done in Guyana. And based on that, you get a basket of goods that represents what the typical consumer would be buying. Typical consumer in the nation would be buying. Or you might do it by regions, as some countries do. We tend to have a Georgetown index, primarily because that's where we get the prices from more easily. But other countries like the US will even have it by every state. So you do that, and that's the basic statistics that we need. And from that, you take a sample based on the household budget survey, and you monitor those prices every day or every week or every hour or hours. In some cases, in the US, those prices are monitored instantly because they go straight into the computer from one computer to another, and the data are aggregated and managed by the Bureau of Statistics of the United States. And those data are published, and that becomes the basket of goods that we call it, that are used to establish the inflation index, the price index from which we calculate inflation. We measure that, and as it behaves over time, as it changes over time, the rate at which it goes tell us whether it is inflation or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have a graph being plotted all the time. So all you have to do is live with a calculus. You calculate the rate at which the graph is moving. That's what you're trying to do. For the cost of living, you're doing something a little bit different. You're trying to measure why it goes up or why it comes down. Because you're trying to take into account the fact that people have to live to survive. They have to be able to satisfy their households. So, and to be able to establish that, you have to establish that they're earning enough to satisfy their desired standard of living, or what it costs to be a living person or a living family in a particular environment. They use a basket of goods, but it's not as comprehensive as that you use for the inflation thing. You take a sample of that sample,
Mm-hmm.
by concentrating the 4 or 5 heavy items that people spend their money on, I would say like food. I'm sure these will be there. Shelter, food, housing. Well, shelter be housing, food,
Yes. Clothing.
clothing, possibly a clothing.
Mhm.
Healthcare will
Right.
definitely be there.
Yeah.
Could be a small basket, but be
Well, right. Right.
representative
Right.
of the. You know what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Good. So,
and you
Professor,
measure those.
and you measure those, right? Right.
But
So,
those tend to be focused not so much nationally, but on particular locations.
uh-huh.
Because usually trying to find out the cost of living in a particular area. That's what history has shown people are more interested in. So unions use it to negotiate. So they might say, look, I'm working the interior. Prices are higher than in Georgetown because they have to transport the goods up there. So you have to pay me a wage based on the cost of living in the area and where I live. So that is why that is important. So all of the countries all have a relationship to each other because they use the same basket of goods, the same economy. They're used in different contexts. The trade unions use those more than the others. You probably must have heard of COLA. You know
Right.
what
Right. Right.
COLA? Cost of living allowance.
Allowance.
So
Trinidad.
everybody
Doing
talk
that.
about
Yeah.
it. So yeah. So that's how unions use it to bargain. So when I was head in the of the University of Ghana Workers Union, we spent a lot of time focusing on that. And we focused on related concepts like the living wage. A living wage is related to that because you want to fight for something for the working groups of workers that represents what they need to earn in order to be able to live satisfactorily. And we established that benchmark by talking about the living wage. That's how that concept grew up. And we try to calculate a whole little basket of goods. I've done that with GPSU and other places. The whole little basket of goods that you can establish what it requires to be able to live in that particular area. But all the concepts you can see have a relationship with each other.
Right.
But you need to understand the categories that they put into it. But all of these categories, I think, come together in that they focus on the income, as you had said in the beginning. They focus on the distribution of income, which is key. And it focuses, even more importantly, I personally believe, on the allocation of the income that you generate in the national economy. That is the investment you make over time, because that will determine the rate of growth of the economy and the expansion that you get in the economic structure of the economy.
Professor
And
Clive.
so, CY, Professor,
Aki, come in.
yes. So, Professor, in all of these indexes which we just spoke about, is it fair to say that the measuring of the basket of goods, or as we call it, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is that a more real-time indication of the cost of living and how it's changing?
Well, that's not really an in time. That's really an indicator of the rate at which prices are rising in the national economy. It's an average. Like all averages, it's not going to be equal to any one except the actual average. It's not going to be identical with any other but the average. But it's representative. It's supposed to be like, if somebody asks you at what rate the prices are increasing, and you would use that because the CPI is comprehensive, far more comprehensive than any other measures we talked about so far, the living wage and things like that, measures. It captures everything based on the household budget survey. But the other indicators are more selective, more biased towards the need for which you're asking for them. They reflect, I think, more concern of the unions and the workers as part of the economy. But the workers and the unions are not the only part of the economy. You have farmers there, you have investors there, you have manufacturers, and they have different interests. They want to see how different prices are behaving. One of the most universal that of those prices, of course, oil, because it is a primary source of energy, and therefore it is distributed widely. That's why the oil price becomes so important to many people. Food, because every living person has to get enough food. But not every economic activity is dependent on food.
Any follow-up there, Kidaki?
Thank you. No, that's okay.
So we can ask, I don't mind.
Yeah. Professor, the big thing in Guyana is the high prices of goods on the market. I mean, you hear Guyanese, now it's the pumpkin thing. A slice of pumpkin, which used to be $200 the other day, is now upwards of $1,000. And people are citing these prices every day as a problem in Guyana. First of all, who or what determines the rise or the fall in prices, and what role the government, if any, has in the prices of goods on the market?
The government has a role, obviously. First of all, some of the commodities might be taxed. So the government, if it has a tax rate like VAT, it has a percentage tax. It will vary, the value of the tax will vary with the price of the goods. So the government always has an interest in the price of those goods. But those goods are part of what we call the microeconomy, the economy where the demand and supply for the particular item is the primary determinant of its price. So in the case of pumpkins, which might be what we're trying to raise now, the price of pumpkin depends upon the demand and supply of pumpkin. Largely, although it might be conditioned by the ability, the demand depends on the ability of people to spend, the incomes that they have. So to that extent, it's also linked to the national macroeconomy, where you talk about the economy as an aggregate of major sectors. But at the micro level, that is for that one particular item, demand and supply will be the primary determinant.
Yeah. And so, Professor, there, how do you?
But one price doesn't make for all prices there.
Right.
The theory, and let me make this further point because many people don't realize it. The further point I think I need to make is that when a price becomes high or too high, it destroys demand. People can't afford it. So that is a self-regulating mechanism too. So you have within the national economy, while these macro sectors are also adjusting to each other, at the micro level, the level of each individual product, that is also happening. So even though people selling pumpkins may put it up to 2,000 or whatever you just said it was, people can stop buying because they can't afford it. And that will bring down back the price. That's how it's supposed to operate. Because less demand, less the price.
It seems as though the prices are not going down. If you listen to people, Starbucks News
the price will not go down below the cost of producing the item or the profit that the individuals can make.
Professor,
because you see some those.
All right, go ahead, Kidaki. Go ahead.
Yes. In relation to these rising prices, and they seem not to be falling. One of the things which has been observed is that the prices are being demand right now is being driven by the fact that Exxon as an oil contractor, let's say, and all of the petroleum related entities in the society are now demanding a lot of the food.
Of course, that is happening. That no doubt.
You say, wouldn't it be wise, therefore, or one shouldn't have expected, therefore, that the agricultural budget, for example, would have been a bigger budget in order to stimulate.
But I said I haven't read. I haven't read
He
the
hasn't read
budget.
the budget, so he wouldn't
But
be
I
taking the lead.
agree that you, of course, we
Unless you're
talked
asking
about it last week.
an hypothetical question.
Yeah, I would certainly support expansion of the agricultural sector. Because one of the reasons we have been able to keep our prices at the rate which is reported in the budget, 4% for 2023. I hadn't read the figure yet. It's because we're largely a food producer. And most of the items that we consume in bulk, in bulk I mean as a high proportion of the average consumer's consumption, are items of food that we actually produce: rice, cereals. We use rice-based cereals. It comes through a lot of this, juices, drinks, a lot of those things. Most of those things which we can't get in other countries, particularly in the rest of the Caribbean. That is why our prices in some years have been growing at a negative rate and been falling on average. Pre-2019, the couple of odd years when that happens, the prices are so static.
So Professor.
But remember at the same time that what we're saying is not just the high price. It is the inflation we have to invoke the notion of the rate at which the prices are growing.
Are growing, right.
Yeah.
Right. But Professor, most of the people on this program, they are concerned about how they can mitigate the high prices that they are facing in the market every day, in the supermarket, in the open market. What can be done to bring relief to them?
The traditional way the government does it is by cutting taxes on some of those items, reducing VAT, cutting shipping costs or import costs if they're imported. They do measures like that to bring down the prices. But the danger of that is why we need prudent management. Is that you don't want to use the budget to subsidize people to be able to live at a standard that really we should not be allowed to live at, because we're not earning that much and we're not allowing incomes to grow that much. We should be introducing more measures to stimulate investment, in which case we need to shift away from removing people from the effects of the market on their own livelihoods. Once you start subsidizing a price, let's say because we're producing oil, we decide to sell oil at cost at $1 a gallon. What will happen if over time the economy runs into difficulty? We can't get oil supplied, and let's say there's an environmental accident. Don't want to wish that on anybody, or something like that, or there's a war and we can't get to ship the oil. The government is locked in now to being able to supply the oil at the price domestically that is out of line and out of sync with what's happening in the rest of the world. So the surpluses we generate in the economy go back into subsidies only to people who produce and consume oil, businesses. And that is a waste, because ultimately the economy will collapse. That's what happened in most the world system.
So what measures what alternative measures would you put in place?
I would go straight to the Buxton proposal, income supplementation. It can't be solved by ad hoc short-term measures. If you take off the taxes and you say up to December, and then they expecting you that after December they can decide whether or not they continue, that's a short-term measure. Those measures, if once you begin to go down that line, will put such a burden on the macro economy. The government will run into a financial crisis because it will be living beyond its means. So the way in which you try to regulate the economy is to ensure that the prices in your economy align themselves with the prices in the world as a whole for which you are buying and selling, so that you do not end up being too far away from that, so that you end up not being able to afford some of the things you want to give your people. That's because the world is out of sync with you. But we're a small, tiny economy. If there's a truly, really serious worldwide inflation, we would get dragged into it because we're such an open economy.
Yeah, yeah. What about wages? What about better wages?
Yeah, that is why we talked earlier about the living wage.
Yes.
The workers got to fight, and that's why I said the important thing is the allocation of income as well as the distribution of income. The problem we have is that the income is so badly distributed that most of the hustler friends of the ruling party are the ones that are carrying the surpluses in the United States, wherever they go in Europe. So billions are going out that way, but we don't focus on it. The government gives billions of dollars to as incentives to the domestic private sector. Nobody has questioned that yet. But the question is how much we want to give to the boxer proposal is far less than is actually given right now to the private sector. It's taken for granted that's the right way to go.
And just in case you in the audience are thinking about what is the Buxton proposal, it is a proposal by Professor Clive Thomas on the behalf of the Working People's Alliance, the WPA, for structured cash transfers. You know, their estimates, I think Professor Thomas had initially said, if you take 10% of the earnings from oil and then you distribute that to the number of households, with each household getting the same amount of money. At that time, he said that if we get our optimum, we could afford to give each household $1 million Guyanese dollars. You know, so when we talk about the Buxton proposal, that is what we're talking about. It's called the Buxton proposal because it was at Buxton or in Buxton in August of 2018 that he unveiled that proposal. It is not a new concept because it has been used in various countries in Latin America and the English-speaking Caribbean. And I think as we speak, some of the countries in the Eastern Caribbean are doing studies now to determine whether they should use that system as a means of distributing resources. So it's not a new concept. And it has been used with success in other countries around the world. The Buxton proposal. Kidaki Amsterdam, any questions for Professor? You've muted yourself.
Yes. We talk about the adjustment, as I would say, in wages and salaries for as a way of mitigating the cost of living, tax exemptions and so on. Well, Professor, you haven't read the budget, so let me say that
we're not dealing with budget today.
I know.
We'll come back and deal with budget maybe next week or the following week when Professor would have had time to digest the budget. So we stay away from budget questions for the time being.
Yes. How does investment of the country's resources, as in this instance, money that is coming from the Natural Resource Fund, for example, using that money to invest in entities such as Gaisuku, affect the impact on cost of living?
Well, it would depend on the particular item, the particular form, and that would largely determine how it will happen. But I can make maybe two broader points that might help to situate I think the issue they want to get at. if you were following my recent article on the last 7 months, it's 6 different ways in which governments can spend oil surpluses and how they have in practice spent it to try to expand their economy in terms of protecting the social life of the community and the vulnerable and the poor and the dispossessed and so on. One is by giving subsidies and cutting taxes, which we talked a little bit about when we discussed it. Another way is by the state providing employment called jobs for state employees, providing more employment through and at the state. So that is another means in which we can do it. This government tries to do a bit of that by offering jobs, usually up in the eastern end of the country, on a temporary basis to persons, and that is treated as a means of social protection. I've given them some income to ensure that they don't run into destitution. That is the second way. The third way is that they can give transfers, cash transfers, to mitigate the effects of the oil, particularly when the oil has a negative effect, as in the case of the Dutch disease, which everybody in Ghana has talked about. By Dutch disease, they meant a situation where you get so rich with oil that the exchange rate begins to deteriorate, appreciate to such an extent that it becomes uncompetitive. Although sugar can't compete with the rest of the world. It doesn't compete now anyhow. But the goods we export do not compete in the markets overseas. And therefore become uncompetitive, and therefore the economy tends to falter in terms of the newer sectors, the new industries we're trying to develop. The fourth way is the other types of transfers, like the ones I think the government has been giving in the papers today, because my wife asked me before the program. I see they giving out a lot of transfers here to the cervical cancer, this, that. Those types of transfers, which are spasmodic, irregular in terms of time length among arbitrarily decided on by the government alone. The fifth way rather that we can do it is by creating what is called a social economy sector. That is by making things like volunteer work, charities and so on, make them commercially available enterprises for the third sector, that is the non-government, the non-private, and the entirely social sector, to begin to generate activity in the country. I introduced that one. Lastly, is the UBI. But I haven't talked much about the social engineering sector, because I think that ultimately is a complementary sector, but that was introduced in the last series on the proposal. I will develop that for more academic purposes, because I think it's a useful complementary mechanism for trying to harness the advantages of most socially engineered efforts, where I find the third sector, that is the volunteer sector, the social sector, people with an interest in doing positive things for the community-driven sector, in other words, could contribute significantly to the development of Ghana. And then lastly, the universal basic income. But I find that without, I don't know about the fifth one, that is the community-based sector, but I haven't seen that right. But without the universal basic income sector, you will not eradicate poverty permanently or quickly enough. The limitation of the social third sector, the community sector, is that it does not have enough investable capital. So it might require the government making a decision to provide finance, because they don't work for profit. They work for social good.
Mm-hmm.
It's a non-profit organization. So how are they going to generate a surplus with which to develop the economy? They're going to have to get funding. So they have to be more like a complement to the other sectors. The government might want to treat it as a complement to the universal basic income, I would recommend personally, because that will also allow for more social harmony, particularly in a divided society like Ghana, racially and otherwise. For us to sort of find ways of getting around some of the disharmony for social life based on the differences among different communities in Ghana. The universal basic income is the way to which we can do it in about 3 to 4 or 5 years. Because we can target a sum of money that gives other families now, I don't know what fraction of I haven't reached that point where I can determine yet how many households are in that situation where they're living below the World Bank defined poverty level. Maybe at this point in time. So we have to establish that, and then we try to meet that as a target. Because we're getting enough money from oil to be able to eradicate. And remember, you only have about 200 to, let's say, 220 households in Guyana. A household in Guyana, 220,000, sorry, households in Guyana. A household is 4.2 persons on average in Guyana, based on the census data. Each household is, but they met many multiple households where people from different families, because of the common law relationship, might be living in one particular house. And a household is defined a place where people have a common roof and share a common pot. They live under one common roof and they share a pot in the house. That is, they share the food. So that was enough to meet the qualified the household. And that is what the Bureau of Statistics also uses to establish a enumeration district. So it's convenient for us as a measure of to do a lot of social analysis. And that is why I've used it in the Buxton proposal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those are the six. Those are the 6 means available to the governments, and what we can further argue. There's 6 the 6 mechanisms, the only 6 mechanisms that have been identified so far that have been tried by any petro state. So we have both empirical and theoretical support for the choice that I made in recommending these things to the WBA.
Professor Clive Thomas there, ending with those ways in which the government can help to mitigate the high cost of living, the high prices on the market. We're going to have to leave it there because we are sharing platforms, and I don't want to. We're having some feedback there, Brother Kidaki. We don't want to encroach on the time of partners. So we're going to leave it there. Professor Thomas, thanks again. Next week when we come, I want us to elaborate a little bit more on the universal basic income, because I think that is very important. So next week we're going to start there. And if you're ready for us by next week with the budget, we'll tackle the budget.
I don't have you ready because it's just right.
Right.
The pile behind me here.
Right.
The pile behind me here.
Yeah, we played by ear. Kidaki Amsterdam, thanks very much for sharing the program with us. And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Kidaki. And to you, the audience, thank you very much for again staying with us. And I hope you've been able to bring some clarity to some of these concepts that are in the public space, the public marketplace, the public lexicon, whatever you want to, however you want to describe it. We hope you've been able to bring some clarity. We're not going to be able to digest all of it at one time, but at least we've been able to pick up 1 or 2 or 3 things and to clarify them. So until tomorrow, I can't remember. I'm getting old now. I can't remember who my guests are going to be on tomorrow. But I know tomorrow we're going to be dealing with race, ethnicity, and economics. Race, ethnicity, and economics. The relationship between race and ethnicity and our economic condition. This is the week of budget. So we're going to be talking a lot about economics and finance and all of those things. So until tomorrow, stay good and remember, love always. Love always.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the